I'd like to first thank everyone for attending, and thank you for the invitation to your wonderful country and city. I've been dying to come to Kiev. I had hoped I would come in a warmer time, but I certainly will try to take an opportunity to enjoy your beautiful city. I think it's very interesting. Mr. Baronoff covered a great deal about the Internet of Things in a very positive way, and I'm going to temper a little bit of enthusiasm by looking at the past and looking at how we've actually managed and secured systems until this point, and talk about some of the threats and some of the challenges that we're going to encounter, as we try to build an Internet of Things to make certain that we don't build an Internet of train wrecks. So. Is this right? Here. So just quickly, I'm going to spend very little time on Internet of Things because Mr. Baronoff did a marvelous job of covering most of the terrain, and I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the characteristics and challenges that we face, and then a fair amount of time on the threat landscape and how the past may give us a prelude to the future. So very, very simply, the Internet of Things is, from a technology standpoint, the next wave of devices. The first wave of our devices were mainframes. Then we had mini computers. Then we had desktop computers. Then we had laptops. Then we had tablets and mobile phones. During the same time, we started to use very, very small chipsets to do embedded devices. We've moved into the very, very early framework of devices that are connected to the Internet that can now affect all aspects of our lifestyle, of our health, and of our society. So there are a couple of things that we can learn from exactly how we actually got to this point in that evolution of rapidly bringing more and more power, more and more computing power, memory, bandwidth to, into smaller and smaller form factors, and what we tried to do with them. So everyone who works on Internet of Things security has some sort of bar napkin that looks like this. We draw different pictures of where you're going to actually see a thing that's connected to the Internet, and what kind of effect that's going to have on our society. Mr. Baronoff's presentation actually covered this and much, much more. Okay. One of the things that we have to pay attention to is that each succession and each wave of technology raises the number of things or devices that we are going to manage, we're going to attempt to secure, that we're going to rely upon by one order or several orders of magnitude. No prior wave has actually taken the scale of devices to the at least theoretical or perceived market size that the Internet of Things may take us to. I mean, if the tens or hundreds of billions that Mr. Baronoff mentioned is truly going to be the case, that's just remarkable. And from a security standpoint, it just scares the pants off me, right? We also know that some of the challenges in doing a great deal of AI, of doing a great deal of communications, of doing a great deal of very, very highly sophisticated applications that are required in things such as autonomous vehicles, or in manufacturing floors, or in agriculture, as Mr. Baronoff pointed out, or in our bodies, is going to require a substantial amount of processing power. It's going to require a situation where you're going to need technology to be available 24/7 by 365 and a quarter by, I think you mentioned 18 years, right? That is a fairly dramatic change from the way that we constantly reboot our Windows machines to do a patch, or that we try to run around looking for a wireless signal that has been dropped. not only are we making things smaller, not only are we embedding them, but we're now placing dramatic differences and challenges on equipment that, at least in this first generation, is going to be constrained in power, constrained in processing, and constrained in memory, because we aren't quite at the point where we have miniaturized to the point where we can have the devices that we need to achieve a lot of the means that and ends that we seek. I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the changes to the way that the internet is going to be utilized, and how machine-to-machine communications is going to be typically more common in the Internet of Things than the human-to-machine communications that we see today. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about how in each of the preceding waves of technology, security and privacy have constantly been at tension or at odds with our desired pace to commoditize, and what the consequence of that collision is going to be. Next. Here. So let's start with machine-to-machine communications. There's a very, very significant difference in the way that the internet is going to be utilized than it has been today. And we don't yet understand what the network engineering may look like. Today, a very large part of the way that we communicate is through client-server interaction. We ask for a web page, we get, which is a relatively small request, we get volumes of information coming back to us. We ask for a movie, a very small request, we get volumes of information coming back to us, right? In the Internet of Things, imagine that your home or your business has hundreds or thousands of devices that are all sensors, that are all gathering information and sending them someplace. Okay? That's a very, very different change. Now you have many, many more bits of information that are constantly being sent towards a server. And the shaping of that is going to be rather different, because instead of maybe the population of people on the internet sending information upstream, you have the population of devices sending information upstream. So now you've got billions of things sending into cores, into clouds. Very, very different change in the way that we're actually going to behave in terms of network engineering and topology. The other thing that's going to be very, very different is that there are a lot of organizations, especially large commerce sites like Amazon and eBay, model their traffic and model the way that they're going to satisfy their customers by human work, home, and sleep hours. Right? Well, devices aren't going to sleep. Devices are going to be sending information every day. Devices are going to need communication every day. Service outages that were acceptable, your website is down for maintenance for 4 hours. Your online game is down for maintenance for an hour. Can't be tolerated any longer, because you're going to interrupt things that cannot be interrupted. So, in addition to the tension that we're creating on the way that networks are operated, we have to think about the fact that we are going to commoditize and drive the delivery and production of devices at a scale that we have never really imagined, except in areas where technology has not been the prominent delivery or product. And in those areas, retail cost is always the key driver. So some of the things that we have to be concerned about is how we are actually going to build devices that have sufficient power, have sufficient memory, have sufficient lifetime, and are sufficiently resilient. Okay. Some people will react by building what are called streamlined protocols. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Some will react by saying, I can't do this with general purpose computing operating systems that we've had to date, and I'm going to build my own. We've been here before. Okay, when we started on the earliest versions of internet-capable phones, many people abandoned the meta languages like HTML and XHTML in favor of lightweight protocols. Okay, by the time those lightweight protocols were actually developed and made available through standards so that everyone could use them and be interoperable, the devices had actually overtaken managed to overcome the deficiencies in processing and in memory and in bandwidth, and rendered the earliest phones pretty much unsuitable for use. And so you have to worry in the retail world of whether you're investing in the wrong direction. And there were lots of companies in the 1990s and early 2000s that invested in the wrong direction, and you can go back and look at the history of their mobile phones and see exactly where they hit the knee and crumbled, okay? Whereas others that stayed the course, most notably Apple and Google, managed to survive and thrive. Okay. So you have this race condition that is going to also confuse the way that we deploy and the way that we build our internets of things. So let me talk a little bit about the threat landscape. We are now going to have devices that are going to control traditionally human-directed activities, okay? Our cars are going to drive themselves. They're going to be assisted in driving. We talked about agriculture earlier. Aviation is something that we already have a fair amount of intelligence and autonomy in the planes and jets that we fly today. Drones are now unmanned. Drone delivery is now becoming a very, very interesting commerce initiative for companies like Amazon. Building fleets of drones that are going to drop boxes on your head all day long is sort of frightening. It's sort of a nice cartoon, but it's also going to be a reality. Perhaps not in the next 3 to 5 years, but certainly in the next 10. Okay. Residential and business environment control systems. All these really, really interesting applications are going to create a couple of really, really interesting problems for us. Okay, they're going to assist us with human biofunctions, assist us with the way that we interact with our devices. But in a lot of cases, there may be no human ability to detect or respond to a malfunction in the way that we are accustomed to today. Okay. Look at the braking systems on a Mercedes-Benz today. I mean, yes, you can brake, but often there are circumstances where the car will brake for you. Okay? If that logic fails, if someone finds a way to exploit a vulnerability in that logic path and they can use it maliciously, there is a consequence. So things can go and break, and they can go undetected until a security event. Security events, however, at this point now place humans at harm. And so this is a very, very different scenario and a very, very different threat model than we've had, up until now. If you look at the history of the way that we have actually evolved from particularly desktops to laptops to tablets and phones to very large communication switches down to the tiny little routers that we use for our access to broadband technologies that allow us to have internet to our homes capable of delivering streaming. You know that each new wave introduces new attack vectors. Okay? We begin with new operating systems, or we customize operating systems. Though each time we go and we take operating systems like Windows, like Linux, or Android, or iOS, and we modify them, or we try to make them simpler, or we try to replace them with something different, we have thousands and thousands of lines of code that are new. Okay? We are relying on essentially a zero error tolerance in the Internet of Things for these things to be reliable, secure, and resilient to attack. Well, we've never done this before, so being optimistic and saying we'll be able to learn how to do this before we have the Internet of Things, up and running is a bit too optimistic for me. So we have to be very concerned about how we're going to do this. And when we go into scenarios where we take an operating system like Linux, and we start to strip out libraries and pull out services and yank out different pieces to make it fit into the memory and the processing capability of a very, very small form factor, we're having an effect on the way that system worked. And I know for years, from years of working on firewalls where we did exactly this, this is a non-trivial exercise. Equally non-trivial is saying, okay, I'm not going to use that. I'm going to start and I'm going to write an operating system from scratch. Now I might have hundreds of thousands of code that has never withstood the kind of attack mentality that exists on the internet today. Okay. We also are making, I think, a very naive assumption that we'll get better at configuring things so that they are secure. We are terrible at this, and we're terrible at patching systems. And consumers in particular don't have the technical wherewithal or the interest in doing this. So a great deal of the way that we are actually going to have to look at Internet of Things is going to require us to be a little bit more circumspect about things that we don't do today. Some of these threats have already been realized. How many of you have heard about the Mirai botnet attack that took down, quote, the internet? It essentially was a massive denial of service attack. No. So this was an attack that was essentially initiated by doing massive scans of the internet, looking for devices that had a port called Telnet that was open. Telnet is a plain text protocol that most people had realized was insecure back in the late 1980s. Okay, and there were devices out there that were not only allowing traffic or allowing connections to devices like routers and DVRs and cameras, but the devices themselves had the original default username and password configured. So it was very possible to go and connect to these as an attacker, install malware, and have the malware do something. Well, tens of thousands of devices immediately became part of a botnet, okay? And that's just using the devices that were vulnerable to this port. Very, very significant. This has become a very, very hot topic. Just this week, we had another scan of a different port. The port was this 7547, which is for SOAP, which is a web access. And through the SOAP, you could actually go and get access to the administrative console of an entirely different set of remote access and broadband access technology. So while we are getting very enthused about the Internet of Things, so are the attackers, because we are creating possibly the most formidable army that could be launched against us in the history of the Internet. The warning bells that Mirai rings for us, the things that we have to pay attention to, is that an Internet composed largely of IoT devices has been exploited. Okay, the compromised devices used a channel that has long been regarded as unsecured and has long been removed from current best practices among most well-developed products. And by well-developed, I will also say the products that don't do this are usually more expensive than the products that do. Okay, the default credentials are known and shared. This is a common problem with the way that we configure our machines today. People don't even know that when they buy a router or they buy a device from off the internet or off the shelf of a box store like I don't know what you have here, but a Carrefour's or a Walmart in the United States or a Target. When you buy those, you're buying what is on the shelf. The consumer doesn't know anything about Telnet. The consumer probably doesn't even read what he's purchased. And even in a case where internet service providers are managing the system for them, we see that some of the internet service providers are lax and leave the default credentials on those devices. Okay, so in those scenarios, we're just fostering an environment where devices can be repurposed for all sorts of kinds of attacks. And remember, if you start out with an operating system like Linux, and someone is able to go and gain administrative control or root on Linux, anyone who has knowledge of Linux can then modify what is installed as a root or administrator so that the device does whatever he pleases. So the possibility of attacks is very, very diverse and very, very nefarious. And DDoS is only one of the kinds of attacks that, that these botnets or these exploits and vulnerabilities can create for us. So this is a very, very significant threat from the security community's standpoint. So as you're building these devices, and the things that we have to pay attention to drive the market in what I believe is the correct direction is the question you ask in your development phase is, can I effectively and correctly prune services or binaries that attackers can exploit if I'm going to start with a general purpose operating system, okay? Or can I actually securely code a custom operating system and improve the security baseline for all IoT devices and have one perhaps or a pair or some that takes us out of a monoculture available for IoT devices. And this is very, very important. This is the baseline. If we don't get the operating system correct, everything we build on top of it, as Mr. Baronoff said, we're going to have multi-level security. Well, everything you build on top of sand relies on your ability to stay stable in sand. So if you'd rather have concrete than sand, you have to think about putting concrete in at the outset. This is just an interesting picture that you can look at when you pull down the slides about the attack plane. The most important thing to remember is that in most race to commodity situations, lowest cost wins and security loses. And this has been historically the case for as long as I have been doing this, and I have been doing this much longer than you imagine because I look much younger than I actually am. The problem is nothing changes if nothing changes. And we have not changed the way our behavior has led us from the 1980s until the mid-1910s. If you also look at hardware, there's a great deal of repurposing the hardware that is currently used in embedded technologies today. Mr. Baronoff gave us some very, very encouraging views of hardware that's going to be available for many, many more years with much less power requirements, with much more processing power, and that's really, really exciting. That's the high capacity chipset. Okay, there are a couple of things we have to worry about. Supply chain hygiene is a term that we use for, we're worrying about devices that are manufactured with backdoors in place, with the ability to operate software or to collect information unbeknown to the person who is acquiring it. And this is very, very significant in equipment in particular that's acquired by nation states. And there's a very big concern about that. Now we're taking situations where we're going to build billions of something and we're going to send it out. And if by the time you actually find out that there's a backdoor in the device, and you've deployed a $500 million of these things, you're already in very, very serious trouble, right? The other thing that we have to worry about is, as we make these chips much more powerful, if we don't secure them, if we configure them poorly, we're giving even more advanced delivery systems for attackers than they have today. So again, this is not, oh, we shouldn't do this talk. This is, we should pay attention to what we're doing. Right? One of the biggest problems and the biggest threats that we see when we encounter these botnet attacks like Mirai is that deploying something that you purchase that's a commodity product creates an immediate challenge of how do you continue to secure them. One of the characteristics of most things that you buy as a commodity is that you buy them, they're built in hundreds of thousands, and they're shipped to stores, or they're shipped directly to a consumer, or they're shipped to an internet service provider in large numbers. Especially when these devices go out to the field, they are now in a situation where they're often not managed. They're often not upgradable. So even if we find a security flaw in some devices, the chances that we are going to actually be able to convince every consumer to go and change their broadband residential router today are very, very small. Imagine how hard that's going to be with some embedded device in a human body, or with devices that are all around our homes or all around our buildings or in our cars. Maintaining the ability to reach back and update the devices that we deploy is critical, yet it is one of the most overlooked and poorly managed aspects of how we actually deliver product today. There's a problem that we call shelf life that exacerbates this. When you are a large a store and you decide you're going to sell a particular product and you buy 100 of them, you're buying 100, and you may buy those in March of 2016. If you then go 6 months later and you buy another 100 because you've depleted half of them, you have 50 that had old firmware and you have 100 that have new firmware. Well, the old firmware tends to get pushed to the back of the shelf. The new firmware is in the front of the shelf. And you end up with these devices that are truly old in terms of their firmware or software that remain on shelves for potentially multiple years. Somebody eventually buys that, puts it in their home network, and they're more exposed to a vulnerability or an attack than the person who bought the one in the front. The consumer is probably never going to be aware of that and is going to just simply go his happy way. So sometimes we may end up with exploits that last for years. Now, take Mr. Baronoff's example of a chip that will survive 18 years and project that same kind of shelf life problem, and you may have somebody who has some device that has a vulnerability in their home or in their body where the vulnerability persists over a decade. So we have to be really careful here. We have to pay attention to some of the things we're bad at. We're bad at providing consumers in particular ways to upgrade their product and keep themselves safe. We have to get better. The other thing that is truly a problem from somebody who's been doing security for 30 years, this is the one thing that sets me off and sets most security people off. As you seek larger markets, as you seek to commoditize and you drive the price down, the perceived value of security diminishes. People tend to say, I've got to get my product to market. I know that if I put this in, it's going to cost me 7 more cents per device, and I'm not going to risk that because my competitor is 7 cents a device cheaper than me. Okay? So the cost of the device typically drives the decision making. The development cost of security is usually much higher than the development cost of just getting the product out. And desired timeframes, or what we call haste to market, drive most manufacturers. All of these things conspire to make security less of a priority than it must be for an Internet of Things. Mr. Baronoff touched on privacy, the other aspect of security objectives, not just to secure the information in transit, but to also protect the information from misuse. Today, commercial use of information that is arguably personal identifying information, whether it be metadata or the exact data, is profound. And it's in my mind as important to pay attention to as surveillance by national security actors. Okay. However, trying to go and convince vendors that it's important to implement protective measures, for personal identifying data, for metadata, into their system is going to be very challenging because they have disincentives. They have disincentives in cost, and they have disincentives because they may not be able to provide the ability to share that data with third parties. The other thing you very rarely hear when you talk about Internet of Things is data protection on the devices. Okay? If these devices are collecting and storing information, are they encrypting the information? How else are they protecting it? Are there ways to back up that information? Should backups be necessary? Are those backup channels corruptible? So these are things we have to pay attention to. I'm going to skip that because in favor of time. I'm going to skip this because Mr. Baronoff covered it, except for the fact that we're probably going to face an interesting scenario as, at least at the beginning of the Internet of Things cycle or wave, in that we're at a transition phase still where the older or IPv4 address space is exhausted. There are very little allocations left that can be divided or distributed among major operators, and people are trying to drive to IP version 6. one of the persistent problems with deploying IP version 6 is that manufacturers have more confidence and can get access to device or firmware that operates IPv4. In those situations, we use something called network address translation. Scaling network address translation in many, many scenarios is very, very ugly. So hopefully we'll have a forcing function to IP version 6, but we may not. If the most popular commodity devices don't implement it, there's no way to force them to implement it. So we can exacerbate an already really painful problem in the addressing space. I'm going to finish just real quickly with ways that we might actually increase confidence, give a little bit of optimism about trying to at least create security mechanisms, and that is to using DNS security in the IoT world. Many channels that we're going to need and many applications that we're going to need in Internet of Things should use encryption. One of the things that we could do with DNSSEC is distribute cryptographic keys from a source that we can prove is truly the entity that we want to access and acquire those keys with, a trusted publisher, with very, very great confidence using DNSSEC. And there's a protocol called DANE that you should look at if you're interested in exactly how this works. So this is some place where what we would be able to do is distribute keys either for local encryption or for communications encryption in a very secure manner, according to and using a trusted infrastructure and a reliable infrastructure that is essential to the Internet today. One question we'll have to deal with is how scalable will the DNS be in a situation where we have billions and billions of requests for this kind of information? I'm pretty confident with the distributed nature of the DNS that we'll be able to do so, but it remains to be seen. Right? So the idea here is that everything that you have in your home or in your residence, you name your refrigerator, your door, your windows, your thermostats, your air conditioner, any other devices that you want to manage, and each of those actually is able to pull down cryptographic keys specific to their application or their need from a distributed repository that is trusted. Right. So let me wrap up and say, the Internet of Things holds great promise. I was really fascinated by some of the applications that Mr. Baronoff presented. I'd love to see them. I worry for each of the 8 examples that he gave that there is a threat that could be materialized and cause great human harm or great economic harm. And I hope that what we will do is not repeat the past, that we will actually go about what we need to do, stop worrying so much about the price and the commoditization, and pay attention to the consequence of rushing to market with technology that is not going to suit the need, and creating great mistrust and undermining the confidence in an Internet of Things that we actually need to have. That's the end of my presentation. I think we have a few minutes for some questions. And if you want to contact me afterwards, please do. I write about a lot of these kinds of security threats at my blog, securityskeptic.com. And again, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much. Вопросы, буквально несколько минут.
We have a few